Daniel, welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. We are going to have a fabulous conversation about China. Welcome.
Always a pleasure, Ben, and it feels like we just spoke.
We've been busy. We've been working on decision making in the poly-crisis era, but you have been working on the China Epiphany, which is your latest book. And I continue to be somewhat awestruck by how prolific you are in terms of writing. And I just want to congratulate you on this latest book. I think it adds to people's understanding of China, and it's an important book. So, congratulations.
Well, thank you, Ben. Truth be known, this was a 3 year project, ultimately, not by design, but I started writing it when I was at AAB in Beijing, and I sort of then put it down for about a year, and then I picked it up again in 2023 and sort of revised a few things and added a few others.
Hmm. So, let's maybe start there. You've written a few books about China, but your perspective, I'm assuming, may have shifted a little bit because you spent 15 months in Beijing at the AIIB. And I'm wondering how that has influenced your perspectives on the country. And maybe if we just start there with the origins of the book. And, we spoke back in June. I put this episode out when you were there. We were talking about COVID and a range of topics and your experiences there, which was very interesting. But now that you are somewhat removed from being in it, if you like, how has your perspective on China shifted, and how is that reflected in the book?
It won't surprise you to hear me say that it's one thing to visualize a country from afar. It's another thing to breathe deeply in the experience of living and working there. And although I had been going to China since 1986, and although I had been there numerous times in various capacities, mostly for business, and there was a time when I was going to Beijing monthly for about a year while I was at ADB, uh, even then, the familiarity that I had certainly didn't compare with what I ultimately came to experience. And having done this during zero COVID made it all the more challenging and also all the more interesting, I would say. We can talk more about that later if you want. But I would say one of the things that I came away with after having lived and worked there and after having completed 3 years with the bank is the awesome power of the Chinese government. And that may not come as a surprise to people who are familiar with it because it is, of course, a monolithic state. Um, it is a one party government and a dictatorship and all these various things. But when you experience the surveillance firsthand, whether it's electronic or in person, when you experience the rules and regulations and how little wiggle room there's basically no wiggle room, especially during a period like zero COVID. Um, it just impressed upon me that they are omnipotent and
Mm.
they have a largely compliant population, which helps make them omnipotent. One of the conclusions I came up with also is that there's plenty of support for the CCP. There's also plenty of silent opposition,
Mm.
but people are generally too afraid to speak out with reason and certainly don't generally express their opinion, although in private settings, I found that many people would. Although
Mm.
being a foreigner and being an American, I suppose, didn't encourage them necessarily to speak too freely to me.
Mm.
On the other hand, maybe it encouraged some others to speak very freely. But it really had a profound impression upon me in terms of thinking about what is it that I would like to say in the book and what impact did the experience have on me. Anyone who's spent any time there knows that it's a force to be reckoned with.
Mm. Let's transition a little bit into the just the origins of the book. You've written other books about China. What's different about this one? What did you want to say that you didn't say in the other books that you've written about the country? And maybe give us a sense of the highlights, the themes, and maybe some of the key messages.
Maybe it would be useful, first of all, to just briefly go over what the previous three books were and what they were about. So, China Vision was about China's desire to basically replicate what it's done at home abroad. And the cover has Xi Jinping looking through a pair of binoculars and seeing only China at the other end. And that's because his orientation, the government's orientation, is very much, of course, what's best for China, but how do we maximize what we did at home abroad? That's the basis of that. The second one was the America China divide, which took a deep dive into some of the fissures that have occurred between the bilateral relationship. And then the Chinese Vortex was a deep dive into the Belt and Road Initiative and all the damage that it has done since it was launched in 2013. This book is different in the sense that it tries to put in perspective the relationship that China has not only with America, but the world as of today, bearing in mind the Trump era, bearing in mind the continuation of Trump-like policies under the Biden era, and bearing in mind the challenges that China is going through right now. My own view is that it doesn't really necessarily change much of anything in terms of what the government's ultimate goals are and how they intend to get there. I think it just makes the road a little bit longer and perhaps a little more difficult. But if we look at what's actually going on in China these days, the government is basically doubling down on everything that it's doing. It's not pivoting and it's not modifying some of its basic policies. It's taking an extremely hard line on corruption and dissent and, you know, business actors and these types of things. And I guess I would make the analogy that when a tiger is backed into a corner, it tends to lash out. I would say that about China at this moment as well.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we could just talk a little bit about, you spent some time at the AIIB, and I found the forward really interesting in that you had to muzzle yourself for 3 years or so to an extent. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that was like and how that, did it feel subversive writing this book in the background? How did you, just the process of pulling this thing together while you were in Beijing and how that worked?
Well, it certainly felt subversive because I was doing it while I was there. And my presumption is that the government would have been monitoring me and my electronic communications. And assuming that they did know and assuming they were aware of what I was saying, I didn't bear any consequences for doing that. Now, I did have diplomatic protections by being with the AIIB. All foreign staff have that. But at the end of the day, there was a line that was drawn. And the line basically was, it's one thing to think something, it's another thing to publish something. And I had come from the orientation of someone who was publishing things weekly on a variety of topics, mostly having to do with current affairs and international relations, until the week that I actually joined the bank. And once I joined the bank, the president's view was that it is not the duty, nor is it the role of an international civil servant to opine on international relations while being employed by an organization like AIIB. And while on one hand I can understand that because AIIB is in theory an apolitical organization, we can talk about that a little bit because apolitical, maybe in quotation marks, it's sort of in its governing documents that's what it is, but certainly the Chinese government has a very heavy hand in the institution, which will surprise no one. But having said that, it's not that I muzzled myself, it's that I was effectively muzzled.
Mm-hmm.
I did not publish anything having to do with international relations, politics, countries, for 3 entire years that I was there, or in the employ of the bank. And that's why producing this book was so important to me. And of course, while I was employed, I also worked with you on decision making in the polycrisis era. So I'm sort of making up for lost time by publishing both of these things in succession.
Mhm.
But it feels pretty good, I have to say, to have my freedom of speech back.
Yeah, I was going to ask you now, like, what does that feel like now that you have your freedom of speech and you can speak freely and post freely, and what does that feel like?
Well, it feels liberating, obviously, and it just feels so good. We take our freedom of speech for granted, but if I ultimately look at the reasons why I left the bank, the biggest reason was the absence of freedom of speech.
Mm.
There were other reasons, including uh, the idea that my country, America, gets no benefit by having me or any other Americans working
Mm.
for this institution since it is not a member of AIIB. And that stood in contrast to my experience with having worked for three other MDBs. And let me just say on that point, the issue of freedom of speech was very, very different at AIIB than it was at the Asian Development Bank, for example.
Mm-hmm.
There, their policy was you can say and publish whatever you want, just don't put the bank's name on it. So
Mm.
you have sort of ADB at one end of the bookshelf and AIB at the other end of the bookshelf. And there's not really much in the middle there.
Mm.
Uh, so having experienced total freedom to publish while I was with a previous MDB, I just found the policy discomforting and objectionable. But
Mm.
it was not so problematic for me that I decided that I'm going to just stop working there. The reason that I worked there in the first place, the reason I accepted the job was that I wanted to operationalize the bank's guarantee program. That's exactly what they hired me to do. And it was one of very few MDBs that didn't have a credit guarantee program. Now that it has it, it's fully operational, and the bank has already put in more than $1 billion of guarantees within the first year of operation. So that legacy will sort of live on. And I felt good about that. The reason why I ended up staying for the full 3 years was that I was given the opportunity to be seconded to COP28 from the bank in May of 2023 through December of 2023. And I thought that was a truly unusual and worthwhile opportunity. So I took it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And we talked a bit about that in the when we talked about decision making in the poly crisis era, because you got a front row seat. You got a front row seat, or you've had a front row seat around two of the biggest dimensions of things that will shape the world for decades to come. So why wouldn't you do that?
The thing that made it all the more unusual for me is that I was a vocal critic of the CCP before
Mm.
I ever joined the bank. And to my knowledge, there was no one else at the bank who was a public vocal critic of the CCP. To the bank's credit, however, that did not prevent them from hiring me. And to
Mm-hmm.
my knowledge, I was not treated any differently than anyone else. And
Mm.
I think that's something that should be emphasized as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that that may be one of the reasons why they did hire you? They want to, keep your enemies closer, kind of a thing.
It occurred to me, but it's not like my
Mm-hmm.
basic premise and orientation toward
Mm.
the CCP has changed in the
Yep.
3 years
Mm-hmm.
hence. It hasn't
Mm.
changed at all. I'm
Mm.
still certainly a vociferous critic, and I do make the distinction between the CCP and the Chinese people. There's a very big
Yeah.
difference between the two.
Mm-hmm.
I say at the front of the book how much respect I have and admiration
Mm.
for the Chinese people, their hard work and determination and all of that, and it's absolutely true. Um, but I'm not I'm not really sure what the ultimate motivation was, except that I had a
Mm.
feeling that maybe the bank likes to have bragging rights, that it not only had a
Mm.
guy like me among its ranks, but that up to 5% of the bank's employees were American at one time when it had fewer numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually pretty significant if you think about it, since
Mm.
America's not even a member. And in fact, there is an American in the president's office. So I think he got some bragging rights as a result.
Mm. Interesting. And why the title? Why the China Epiphany? What?
It's an epiphany in terms of what I'm thinking America and the West needs to do in order to not only give China a run for its money, but actually defeat China in the global arena. And one of the core themes in the book is that the Western nations need to become much more aligned in their basic policy toward China. So many European countries, for instance, are first and foremost focused on commercial relations with China, and politics sort of takes a back seat. But if the West is ultimately going to defeat China in the global arena, all of our resources have to be marshaled toward this task. And that also means that we need to do a much better job of devoting both public and private sector resources toward this task. One of the advantages that China has is that it commingles public and private sector routinely, which gives them many more resources, many more bright people, et cetera, to go toward a common goal. The West and America are not really so good at that. And in terms of marshaling resources, as you know, China is not exactly shy about devoting tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars to a given task. AI comes to mind. Their objective of achieving AI supremacy by 2030 and having devoted $150 billion toward that task. The West just doesn't have any magnitude similar to that. And we spend too much time playing catch up. We spend too much time playing catch up. And when the BRI came out, for example, China had devoted close to $1 trillion toward the program before the US and the West marshaled any kind of meaningful response toward that. We have to get out of that habit as well. We have to be at the forefront. We have to stop being reactive. We have to be more proactive if we want to get in front of the game.
I'll just add a few things and just share how your work actually influenced my work at British Telecom, because in 2019, British Telecom became the first foreign telecoms company to win a license in China. And we had conversations about your previous books about China, and I was trying to raise the alarm. I was saying, guys, like we need to think a little bit differently. It's not just because we're awesome that we got this telecoms license. There's probably more going on here. It's also a much more complicated operating environment. And so your work really influenced my ability to try, and I say try because I'm not sure that it was completely successful, but to try to overcome what you just described, I think is a lot of antiquated thinking about China, because there were people in the company that said, we absolutely have to be in this market. There's no way that we have to take advantage of this opportunity, blah, blah, blah. And maybe that was appropriate 15 years ago. And I shared some of the stories of companies that ran into difficulties. You mentioned Microsoft, for example, in your previous book. And that took some people aback. But it wasn't until, I think it was a year and a half ago, where the joint heads of MI5 and the FBI issued this sort of warning to basically the British business community about China as a security threat. And people started to think, oh, but you were sounding the alarm a little bit. And you have a phrase in the book about the West being asleep at the wheel. And maybe we could dive in a little bit more about what does that mean, the West being asleep at the wheel. And you have a chapter about China's influence in multilateral institutions and what's happened while the West has been asleep at the wheel.
Well, so much has happened. Where to begin? I think, first of all, the profit motive has been such a driver for Western companies vis-a-vis China, with 1.4 billion people and the promise of a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. The truth is that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow sometimes never materializes for these companies. And if it does materialize, it may take 10 years to get it, and it may be short-lived. And in the meantime, you end up having to jump through all sorts of legal hoops, and you have to have a Chinese joint venture partner, and you have to produce your own foreign exchange. You can't utilize any of the government's foreign exchange, et cetera, et cetera. It's actually a very difficult place to do business for foreign companies. Sure. And I think COVID ended up sort of curing a lot of companies of that belief that they had to be there, that they had to access those consumers, and that they had to stay there. A lot of companies just threw in the towel during COVID and said, we're just not going to do this anymore. We can't do this
Mm.
anymore. Um, that's not to say that China has somehow graduated to irrelevance in the
Mm.
global marketplace. It certainly has not. It's very, very important, but supply chains have been replaced for many
Mhm.
companies. And in a way, implementing zero COVID in China, they did that to themselves by making the operating
Right.
environment so impossible for so long
Mm.
that so many companies just sort of threw in the towel. That all said, I think ultimately it's sort of like we need a harsh dose of reality. I don't credit former President Trump for very much, but one of the things I do credit him for is sort of hitting the American people and the West upside the head with a two by four when it comes to China, to basically say, hey, folks, this has to change. This is not
Mm.
sustainable, and we're not going to do this anymore. And the fact that the Biden administration has carried on not only with virtually everything that Trump had put into place, but doubled down on some of these things, tells me that at least in the halls of Congress in America and in many businesses in America, they have been cured of that previous idyllic notion about having to be there and how they couldn't afford not to be.
Mm.
Ultimately, if alternative supply chains aren't created, and if alternative means of producing goods aren't identified, then things will remain the same. And there's only
Mm.
so many alternative places to go that have the types of infrastructure that are necessary, the type of workforce, et cetera, in the world. And many of those have already been, grasped by a lot of
Mhm.
these other companies. So it's not necessarily a straightforward problem to solve. It takes
Mm.
a lot of thinking and a lot of time and
Mm.
resources in order to transition away from such
Y-
dependence on
Yeah,
China. Apple
you
is a
meant
good
yeah.
example, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
They they made a
Yeah, I
conscious
was
decision to transition to India, and that's working out pretty well for them.
mhm. You mentioned a few really important things to maybe get across. One is your first chapter is called The Global Battleground. You talk about the differences or the continuity between Trump and Biden. And I hear the point being made there that this is not going away. This is structural. This is geopolitical competition. And whoever wins the 2024 elections, it isn't going to matter. This is going, from a US China relations perspective, largely this is still going to be an issue. The other thing that, again, coming from an internal corporate risk management perspective, I would hear the commercial teams say, well, people are still interested in China, blah, 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 but they are. But from a supply chain perspective, one has to realize that it takes sometimes years or even decades to transition, right? And so you have companies that are diversifying and doing their utmost to diversify. They will still have a footprint in China because it takes a long time to build all the infrastructure in Vietnam or wherever else, India or wherever else companies are diversifying to. So all that is to say that the trend is geopolitical competition, if that's what I'm reading and what you're saying, and that's not going to go away. Is that right?
That's very much the case. And it's very much the case, of course, not only in North America, but around the world. There are a lot of countries that have taken a very hard look at their relationship with China as a result of zero COVID. And some of them have done a better job of transitioning than others. But there's no denying that on a global basis, everybody understands what China and the Chinese government are and what they are not. And at this point, I don't expect that there are too many people out there who have some starry eyed notion that all of a sudden there's going to be a transition to liberal democracy and the hardline approach to domestic and foreign policy is somehow going to change.
Hmm.
It's just not.
Yeah.
Everybody's heels are dug in.
Hmm.
Certainly they are in North America
Hmm.
and, of course, in China. And I think what we should be doing is just getting on with the business of transitioning away
Mm,
from
mm,
China from a business perspective. Now,
mm, mm,
that all said, I would also add that it's equally important that we find a way to embrace what we can with China.
mm,
And it may be a short list of things that we might be able to
mm,
embrace, whether it's working together on climate action, whether it's working together on replying to natural disasters, or whatever it may be. There is scope to do that.
mm,
But we're not going to be collaborating on space exploration.
mm,
We're not going to be collaborating on sharing or finding rare earth minerals.
mm,
That's just not going to happen. And
mm,
unfortunately for the West, China's gotten a huge head start in some of these things.
mm.
They have a lock on so many precious metals
Yeah.
in the deepest, darkest corners of Africa and Latin America that unless there were to be some cessation of those contracts, they've got a lock on
Mm,
all of these things, which is going to be hugely important as we race toward global EV and renewable energy on a global basis and all of that sort of stuff. They're thinking decades ahead
mm,
while we're still thinking about getting our shoes on and which direction we want to go.
mm. Perhaps we could talk a little bit about China's influence in multilateral institutions a little bit more, just because I think that there is the institutions that we have are a reflection of liberal values. They've been designed as such, and the world order is, for lack of a better word, is a liberal world order in many ways when we look at institutions. And I want to know how China has been changing that and what that means for the world. And perhaps you could give us a little bit of an idea of the key messages in that part of the book and what that means for the world.
I think the perspective that the Chinese government is coming from is that, yes, we were part of creating the post world order. And although we didn't think about creating these multilateral institutions, the UN and the World Bank and all of these entities that came immediately after the World War, we benefited actually from having joined them. That all said, now China doesn't feel, and many other developing countries, although China's really not a developing country, we can talk about that too, they feel that they don't have a proper seat at the table, whether it's at the UN or elsewhere. And that is what prompted the development of entities like the AIIB and the New Development Bank. They wanted to have China-based multilateral entities, and they wanted to have the Brazils and the Russias and the Indias of the world, in the case of the New Development Bank, at the head of the table, rather than just one of 20 other voices.
Mm.
Um, I understand why they felt that way, actually.
Mm.
The interesting thing is that they have and have not at the same time had a significant impact on the development business. One of the reasons I think in AIB's case is that it doesn't have the word development in its name. It is not technically a development bank, it's an investment bank. It is for profit, whereas the other MDBs are not for profit. Now, that's a huge difference. And they are not shy about saying that development is a business for them. And ultimately, one of the driving forces is that they want to increase China's soft power footprint around the world in the process. Now, you could argue that any of the other MDBs basically enhance their own soft power input by doing what they do. But there are some important differences between the two. Let's also look at the shareholding relative to total equity and total shares that China has in many of these institutions versus that of the US and Japan and Western European countries. China has a much less significant stake in many of these multilateral entities, but as I discuss in the book, they have been masterful at maximizing their influence in these entities. And that is largely a function not only of their desire to do so, but also the fact that there are holes in some of the regulations which allow them to do so. As a result of that, they have oversized influence in the UN and at the Inter American Development Bank and a number of other institutions.
Mm.
At the Inter American Development Bank, they wield almost as much influence as the US in some instances, but their shareholding is in single or barely double bit digits. I'd have to remember what exactly it is. That all said, hats off to China for being able to
Mm.
do that. They're
Mm.
masterful at identifying where the holes are, taking
Mm.
two steps forward and one step back, and you do that often enough and you have a new boundary. And part of the reason they're also able to do that is that they're not stopped from doing so within these institutions. So you have to ask
Mm.
yourself, who is to blame here? Is it
Mm.
China's ambition, or is it the absence of collective action on the part of these other entities to prevent them from doing some of the things that they do? There's always two sides to the story. But I found that chapter particularly interesting because the more I researched it and the more I wrote about it, I certainly saw a pattern developing.
Mm.
And all I can say is kudos to China.
Mm. I guess it's part of statecraft, but again, as you describe that, it harkens back to being asleep at the wheel. And maybe, or maybe it's not being asleep at the wheel. Maybe the West is preoccupied by global financial crisis. We can list any number of other things going on, but it does seem like a strategic
I
error.
don't disagree. I think the West has paid a high price for looking the other way so often
Mm.
when China has done some of the things that it does. The Spratly Islands and the South China Sea comes to mind. Basically, China just walked right in there, and the
Mm.
US and the West did virtually nothing to stop them, even though it was
Mm.
clearly illegal actions. And now, of course, those islands, the Paracel Islands, all of those which China has occupied, are military projection points, and they're fortified, and we're not getting the Chinese out of there at this point.
Mm.
So they're making up for some of their lack of a proper, forceful blue water navy, even though they have the world's largest navy, by projecting their power in ways like that. And we have ourselves to blame for allowing it to happen, I would say.
Mm. We'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about Taiwan and the relationship between China and Taiwan. We have talked about it in other contexts, but I'm wondering how you see it and what you see the prospect for reunification and or violent conflict.
I think we're closer to having the moment of truth on Taiwan than we have been since it became an independent entity. And part of the reason for that is that China has a much more robust capability to project its power, particularly from its own shores, close to its own shores, as in the case of Taiwan. And I think people understand that if they were to try to take Taiwan by force, which is a possibility, of course, it could well lead to a third world war because then the US and Japan and Korea, maybe Australia and India, everybody dives in to this thing. And before you know it, we have a huge conflict. China's mindful of that. China, I believe, would prefer not to have to take it by force. But now that Xi has basically told Biden, I'm going to do this, it may not be this year, it may not be next year, but I'm going to do this. And I hope it doesn't require
Mm.
me to take it by force. He's basically putting the West on notice that this is going to happen. If you look at his proclamations about when it's supposed to happen, he had asked the PLA to be ready to be able to project its power in Taiwan by 2027. That's not very far away.
Mhm.
And wouldn't surprise me at all if there's a temptation on his part to take advantage of some of the other turmoil going on in the world to perhaps move that timetable up. I've got to
Mm.
think that's a very serious concern of militaries around the world, certainly the US military. And I do find myself wondering ultimately
Mm.
what America and the West would do if that happened. Because we have a distinct disadvantage. We're not going to win a
Mm.
ground war in
Mm.
Taiwan. We just have too many
Mm.
disadvantages. So if you're not going to win the war, the question is, do you fight the war?
Mm.
It's a good question.
It's a good question. My understanding as well, though, is that this would be incredibly costly for China as well, also because it's a mountainous, island. There are very few beachheads, and the military buildup would not be a surprise. You'd have to mobilize quite for quite a long period of time, and so that it would be costly on all sides. However, and we've talked about this, but the possibility of a blockade or other things, internal interference, a whole range of things could also occur that fall well short of certainly World War III, but a violent military conflict over Taiwan. Curious what your thoughts are there.
My expectation is that in the first instance, an economic blockade is likely to be the first course of action.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on how effective it is and how long it takes, then some military options might be pursued. It's also interesting, I do discuss in the book that there were periods throughout Chinese history when it basically ignored Taiwan and didn't want anything to do with it. So what I think is happening is that the government has decided to cherry pick those periods from history where it was close to Taiwan or it wanted Taiwan versus those where it did not. And at this point in time, it's almost a wag the dog type of exercise because China has so many challenges internally and externally that you would think this would be the perfect thing to get people riled up nationalistically and wave the flag and let's not think about all of those problems. Let's coalesce our forces and our thoughts toward this issue. It's entirely possible. I don't hear anyone who is a China commentator saying that's impossible that this would happen.
Let's maybe use that to transition. You talked about the internal problems, and you did say that during your time there, you would hear the odd thing that people are concerned about that they wouldn't dare say publicly. We do know some things about China, the levels of inequality going up, the challenges trying to maintain economic growth, all of these things. What are China's struggles, challenges internally that we don't hear so much about? Where is it worried?
In one sense, China's domestic problems are not entirely different than that of most major countries, right? The ability to keep the plate spinning and keep GDP growth high, the ability to produce jobs, the desire to enhance market distribution, all these types of things. I think the difference here is that there's a number of things that are coalescing at the same time. One of them is youth unemployment, which is in excess of 25%. Another is the idea that there are many people who are maybe in their 20s and 30s who don't really want to work, don't care that they don't want to work, they don't want to play the game. They call it lying flat. And interestingly enough, I was touring through Baku in Azerbaijan a few weeks ago, and I ran into some young Chinese folks there, and I met a couple of them who are indeed lying flat. And I talked to one of them about it, and they don't particularly care if they don't make money and they don't live a better life than their parents, et cetera. But that's a big problem because China's population is falling, right? Plates spinning, and the levels of non-performing loans have risen tremendously, and the real estate sector has enormous problems. It's been overbuilt. There's been too much money that's been pumped into it, and there's just not enough buyers for all these buildings that have been built. These are the types of things that are just enormous problems for the Chinese government, and they're not short-term problems. They're long-term problems. And when they're trying also to keep the plate spinning and then project their power globally, and they've got these types of things internally to deal with, it's a very difficult thing.
And are those the types of things that you would hear in whispers, in silence, or in silent rooms, and these kinds of things from people that you met in China, Chinese people that you met?
Most of the whispers that I heard from people who cared to share these types of things with me were more along the lines of they really wish they had a different government. And again, one of the things I say right up front in the book is that I think the Chinese people deserve a government that's more genuinely attuned to their interests and whose ultimate modus operandi and ultimate objective is not the perpetuation of its own power. And that is, of
Mm-hmm.
course, what the CCP is all about. It's got about 95 million people in a
Mm-hmm.
population of 1.4 billion,
Mm-hmm.
and it's got half a dozen people at the very top who are making all these decisions. And you would think it's not sustainable, but the problem is that over the decades it's been very sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
And now I would argue that the CCP has such a vice like grip on Chinese society, there is no way they're going to be overthrown. People who say, the end of the CCP is near, I don't buy a word of it. I think they're
Mm-hmm.
far too powerful in every way.
Can you also share anything around? I mean, I guess when you have something like the CCP, an entity like this, and we've seen bits and snippets of things like corruption and local level, politicians, and the amount of potentially fraudulent activity that goes on, what all of these things, that these are that this goes on at a widespread scale. And is this a problem? Are people talking about this? Do we have a sense of the scale of the problem? And it sounds like it may be going on, but it poses no threat to the CCP for whatever reason. But I'd be keen to hear your insights on corruption in China.
Since electronic communications and every form of communication are
Mm,
so closely monitored, one of the
mm,
things that doesn't generally happen is you don't generally get the sort of mass instant movements that you'll see in the West through social media as a result of this. Now, you might say what happened with zero COVID at the end was an example of that type of force in action. And it's not that it can't happen, and it's not that it doesn't happen. But I heard stories, numerous stories, of someone who might have said something derogatory about the CCP. And within an hour or two, there
mm,
were state security people knocking on their door. And they were either hauled away or given a warning or whatever it might be.
mm,
I mean, can you imagine living in a society like that where
mm,
you have absolutely no freedom of speech? And if
mm,
you dare to speak your opinion and they
mm,
hear it and it's deemed to be objectionable, you're hauled away. There's just a take no prisoners kind of approach to this thing. They have zero tolerance for this kind of thing, which tells me all I need to know about their intentions of staying in power for a very long time.
And I guess you spent time in China, growing up as an American. You know what freedom of speech is and looks like. But if you don't know, then you don't know what you don't know. So culturally, I imagine that it's difficult to the average the Chinese citizen, most Chinese, vast majority of Chinese citizens won't have that suffocating feeling that you had in your 15 months in Beijing. I would have thought it just
Let me give
stands
you an
to reason.
example, Ben. I spoke with a guy who I thought was fairly switched on. He was a political risk analyst, a Chinese guy in Beijing. And we started having a conversation about the theft of intellectual property.
Mm,
And I mentioned that my understanding was that the Chinese government had stolen the plans for the F
mhm,
35 jet fighter, and that as a result of that, the Chinese version of that jet basically, leapt forward and it looked very similar to the F 35, et cetera, et
mm,
cetera. He thought I had no idea what I'm talking about. That
mm,
couldn't possibly be true. Where did I get this information?
mhm,
From his perspective, that was simply impossible. Now, this is a guy, though, who has access to the
mm,
internet and who does study
mm,
countries. And I just found the level of
mm,
ignorance to be astonishing. So he's either drinking the Kool Aid or the information he has access to is severely curtailed, which is undoubtedly true,
mm.
or he just doesn't want to believe it. And so you have a
Yeah,
whole
self-censoring.
bunch of people there, yeah, who are self censoring, who are basically saying, nope, that's simply not true. It's inconsistent with everything that I know. And as a result, it can't be
Mm,
true.
mm. Psychologically, that's fascinating how people do that. But we know how that
Mm.
works now. We understand people that believe the weirdest of things. Collectively, if you have a whole country like that, it's self reinforcing. It must be very, very difficult, almost impossible to even think of something else, ask the question, and then speak out. Can you imagine? It just
Well, you have to
doesn't
be a very brave
compute.
person to be a
Yes.
very brave person to speak out in China.
Yes. So the other thing that we are hearing, or I've been reading about, and again, I'm not entirely sure that how much of that this is true, but that the wave of nationalism has gone up a fair bit. I don't know if this is something that's not, I don't know how you measure that or what have you, but the sort of anti, the people getting up in arms about the perceived slights and leading to protests, pro China protest or pro demonstrate. Is that visible? Did you see that? What do we know about how the government in China, or how people can just sort of foment this sort of nationalistic sentiment? Because that's worrying to me. I think
Well,
that that just that's how you mobilize people for war, right? Like that's not it's not comforting in the slightest.
that's exactly right. There's a fair level of ignorance among the Chinese people because they don't have access to free flowing information,
Hmm.
and because they've been subjected to anti American and anti Western propaganda for so many decades. And of course, the Chinese government is a well oiled machine in that regard, like so many other governments are for their own purposes. So I don't necessarily see too many differences between how the Chinese government gets its messaging across versus how other governments may do it,
Hmm.
except maybe they're much more blatant about it and there's no degree of subtlety. But can you imagine the cognitive dissonance that the average Chinese person would have experienced last November when she went to San Francisco and was trying to make nice with Biden and vice versa? Then they filled the airways with the two leaders handshaking and smiling, and all of a sudden it's how can we work together? I mean, they must have seen the incongruity with all of
Hmm.
that. Governments do what governments do. China is no different than other governments in that regard, except that the well oiled machine that they have is awe inspiring.
Right. I do want to talk about AI and asymmetric warfare. I don't want to spend heaps amount of time because we do talk about that in the polycrisis era. We've talked about that in the past, but there might be someone listening to this who hasn't come across some of your views on this, or maybe indeed there may be some new things since we last spoke about the topic. But it might be useful just to touch on the race for AI supremacy, where China is in relation to the rest of the world, the US and the rest of the world, and maybe what that means.
So, China, as you can appreciate, is making great leaps in a lot of different areas related to AI, whether it's quantum computing, whether it's hypersonic weaponry. And America and the West are doing some of the same thing. But for instance, with hypersonic weaponry, they've already mastered some basic elements of it. And
Hmm.
my impression is that we're not nearly as far in doing that. The Russians have done the same thing. And it's a question of allocation of resources and spending the money and the time and devoting the personnel in order to get this stuff done. But once you've cracked that nut and you've mastered that, then your adversaries who don't have that capability are at a really distinct disadvantage. That's where we are with hypersonic weaponry vis-a-vis
What is
China.
hypersonic weaponry?
When
What
it comes
can you
to,
explain what it?
it's the ability to go beyond multiple times beyond the speed of sound. They have a missile, in fact, that can circumnavigate the globe more than once and do something like completely accurately recreate the glide path that it was on to begin with, and then hit a really specific target many, many times after it has, gone at that velocity. Um, it's the type of thing that we want to be able to say that we can use hypersonic weaponry to prevent a missile from hitting our shores, right? An ICBM, for example. And most of the time, when we've done that, our tests have failed.
Mm,
So I get very concerned when I hear this, particularly when you realize how advanced North Korea has become with some of its ICBM capabilities. And I'm feeling like America and the West is pretty vulnerable at this
mm,
stage from a military perspective. Now, we have certain advantages that they don't have. And when it comes to quantum computing, we've made some recent breakthroughs just as recently as 2023, whereas you don't necessarily hear as much about what they're doing. That doesn't mean they're asleep at the wheel by any means. They're absolutely not. The sense that I have is that some of the advantages that we have are slipping from our grasp. And
mm.
if we don't bolster them, and if we don't do something to change the basic calculus in some of these things like hypersonic weaponry, we're going to fall so far behind that the race is going to be over. That's my concern.
And what does that mean? Like, what does that look like from, let's say it's a China run world, a China dominated world. What does that look like? What can we tell? That what can we
Well, it's not going to be
discern?
very favorable to China from it's not going to be very favorable to China from the perspective of the global population because Pew uh, survey after Pew survey has shown that China's popularity among the global population has actually been slipping pretty
Mm,
consistently and is at something like an all-time low. Zero COVID contributed to that, but
mm,
as the world becomes more awakened to some of the things that China does in the global arena, they become increasingly concerned. And the Belt and Road Initiative certainly didn't help this. There's a lot of
mm,
countries that are now highly indebted that weren't before they participated in this program. And there's been the expropriation of some of those assets in the home country. It's not supposed to work that way by the Chinese. I mean, can you imagine another country going into China and expropriating an asset? That would never happen, right?
it's weird. Yeah.
And yet, based on some of the agreements that these countries signed, that
Mm,
gives China the ability to do that kind of stuff. People
mm,
see that and they're just gasping. They're just
mm,
shocked that this type of thing can happen. Now, she has talked recently about a more friendly form of the BRI, but I don't know how you do that when you've already spent a decade with debt trap diplomacy and doing some of the things that it has done. How do you hope to change people's minds? How do you hope to get governments to want to
mm,
warm up to your latest suggestion about what they should be doing? And then, given that China keeps fighting to have itself included in some of the debt restructurings along the
mm,
lines of the Paris Club and some of these other multilateral development bank
mm,
financings, they're just they're shameless. They're basically saying,
mm.
yes, yeah, we did all of that stuff, but we still want our money.
Here's a thought that's kind of out of left field about all of this. In order to get that turned around, if you were China, and that would be, and the thought is to make China cool. So in other words, to export culture like American culture, right? Movies and music and just popular culture, and disarm people, and all of this kind of a thing. That takes time. But if you look at the role of American culture around the world, it certainly has had, I would argue, that type of an impact. That there is something positive about having American cultural dominance. Just curious what you
It
what
has
you might
indeed.
what you think
I
about
think
that.
it has indeed. I think China's gone about it in a slightly different way. They're doing it
Mm,
more through the sale of their products and the
yeah,
giving away of some money for cultural centers and museums and that type of
yeah,
thing. And so it's not that they're not
mm,
doing that sort of thing, they are. But at the end of the day, that stands in contrast to some of the other things that they're doing. And when
hmm,
people are asked around the world, who would you rather be governed by, the US or China? 80, 90% of them are
yeah,
saying it's the US. And
yeah.
as long as that remains the case, I don't think that there's too much risk that whatever China's ambitions are vis a vis soft power globally, that it's going to have too much impact.
Conscious of time, but I always like to end on maybe a bit more of a positive note. And I'm wondering where the West and China can, collaborate, cooperate. You mentioned climate change. I'm also guessing that what we're looking at really is a situation where the West and China need to find ways to coexist. What are some of your key insights or thoughts around that topic, just to maybe leave us on perhaps a little bit more of a positive note around the way forward?
Well, I've already mentioned a couple of those. You did as well, climate action and natural disaster relief, these types of things. There have been other examples where they have collaborated. China and the US, for instance, collaborated in retrieving some nuclear material from Nigeria that was under threat of falling into rebel hands some years ago, for example. It really ultimately boils down to a willingness to do this because both countries have the capability to do it. Do they have the willingness? And I say at the end of the book, it all boils down to the extent to which they want to do it, they're willing to devote their resources, and they're willing to stick with it. Because when you have a new geopolitical crisis or there's a new bump in the road with bilateral relations, the tendency is to close the door, cut off communications, and then whatever you might have been working on collaboratively just falls by the wayside. There has to be a commitment from both countries, from all countries, to do that and stick with it. The question is, will they do that? And if Trump were to get in, I don't see that as anything positive for U.S.-Sino relations. I don't see the continuation of the Biden administration as particularly positive for the future of U.S.-Sino relations. It's sort of like we need some wholesale change on our side. Of course, they need some wholesale change on their side as well. And until that happens, I don't know that there's going to be much that's going to change.
Okay. We've covered a lot of ground. Was there anything that we just didn't get a chance to mention that you think is worthy of note?
I would say that there's a lot of people who study China. There's a lot of people who are constantly looking at China and Sino-U.S. relations. It's a bit like an amoeba, right? It's constantly shifting, and there are some basic elements that won't change and other things that yield some positive aspects in time. I would say we need to get the Taiwan issue resolved. We need to get the basic framework for bilateral relations in a positive way between the US and China to occur before we're going to have reason for genuine optimism in this relationship. And it's sincerely my hope that we get there.
You mentioned resolving the China-Taiwan issue. What do you think that looks like? What could that look like?
Yeah, I'm not seeing many
realistic
positive options at this point. I think what we could have a breakthrough in the sense that there could be some initiative that is introduced that basically says, can we all back down from, the DEFCON position that we're in and ratchet things down, ratchet the heat down. I wish I knew what that's likely to be. I just don't see that happening in the current environment.
Watch this space, I guess. Daniel, thank you so much. This was fascinating, very interesting as always. The book is called The China Epiphany. It's available on Amazon. So you've got print and Kindle versions. Is there an audio book version as well?
There will be in a month or so.
Okay, great. So we'll put links into the show notes so people can pick up a copy. Thank you very much. Pleasure as always, and wish you all the best with the book. And let's keep these conversations going.
And thank you, Ben. It's always a pleasure.